Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, from the preface, paragraph 3. Demanding and supplying these superficial explanations passes readily enough as a concern with what is essential. Where could the inner meaning of a philosophical work find fuller explanation than in its aims and results? And how could these be more exactly known than by distinguishing them from everything else the age brings forth in this sphere? Yet, when this activity is taken for more than the mere beginnings of cognition, when it is allowed to pass for actual cognition, then it should be reckoned as no more than a device for evading the real issue, die Sache selbst, a way of creating an impression of hard work and serious commitment to the problem, while actually sparing oneself both. For the real issue is not exhausted by stating it as an aim, but by carrying it out. Nor is the result the actual whole, but rather the result together with the process through which it came about. The aim by itself is a lifeless universal, just as the guiding tendency is a mere drive that as yet lacks an actual existence. And the bare result is the corpse, which has left the guiding tendency behind it. Similarly, the specific difference of a thing is rather its limit. It is where the thing stops, or it is what the thing is not. This concern with aim or results, with differentiating and passing judgment on various thinkers, is therefore an easier task than it might seem. For instead of getting involved in the real issue, this kind of activity is always a way beyond it. Instead of tarrying with it and losing itself in it, this kind of knowing is forever grasping at something new. It remains essentially preoccupied with itself, instead of being preoccupied with the real issue and surrendering to it. To judge a thing that has substance and solid worth is quite easy. To comprehend it is much harder. And to blend judgment and comprehension in a definitive description is the hardest thing of all. Okay, let's see. So I love the way he starts off this paragraph with this phrase, demanding and supplying these superficial explanations. And says that, he's talking about kind of the average everyday understanding, common sense, what the ordinary man thinks of as thinking, what passes for good reasoning. What he usually will again refer to by the term Verstand, usually just translated as understanding, but we need to remember that in Hegel that's always kind of a pejorative term. Merely to understand is only to catch one side of a thing, and real reason needs something more than that. It needs to be able to trace the limit of the thing, what it differs from. It understands that the essence of everything has to do with what it's not. It has to do with what sets a stop to it. Right in the middle of the paragraph, he says, the specific difference of a thing is rather its limit. It is where the thing stops, or it is what the thing is not. And that's what we're aiming to formulate, whereas this Verstand, this everyday understanding, thinks that it's already captured the essence of the thing merely by being able to formulate true propositions about it. And again, the phrase that he starts off with here, demanding and supplying, it's hard to hear those, the supply and demand. We're thinking of economic principles here, specifically bourgeois economic principles, the very principles that Marx will come to critique somewhat on the wings of Hegel's style of reasoning. He'll demonstrate that supply and demand is really an insufficient way of accounting for the price of a commodity, that there's always a secret being suppressed by an analysis that deals only in that relationship of supply and demand. Specifically, what it suppresses is the extortion of surplus value from wage labor, but that's really another book. But anyway, the fact that he starts off with a couple of terms that come straight out of classical economics, I think that tells us a little bit of something about what he means by Verstand. He understands this to be the common sense of the bourgeois ruling class, the money makers, those who think that because they understand how to extort surplus value from wage labor, how to maximize profits, suppose that means that they understand everything. They're the guys that tend to formulate theories of everything. And believe it or not, I think Hegel in the end is going to be against that sort of thing, though from a certain angle it does look like he's attempted a very, very ambitious theory of everything in his full philosophic system. Anyway, just to note that I think those terms bear a maybe a secondary meaning. I don't know if Hegel himself intended them that way, but they have a connotation of economic commerce, of traffic, of commodification, and so forth. And I think later Marxists are going to basically view Hegel as laying the groundwork for a critique of that bourgeois style of reasoning, where it's just kind of an exchange in conclusions and arguments rather than a following out of the full historical process by which these problematics rise and decline. He also introduces here a term that he's going to, one of those very inconspicuous terms that turn out to be very, very important for him, die Sache selbst. He mentions in this paragraph, and our translator here translates that as the real issue. It's actually it's a hard phrase to translate. It means something like the heart of the matter, or the point, or the real substance, or the depth of the issue, as opposed to something more superficial. And he thinks that die Sache selbst is precisely what this sort of reasoning through Aristotelian principles of non-contradiction and simply trying to sort through and taxonomize correct conclusions. He views that style of reasoning as having missed die Sache selbst. It fails to treat the real depth of truth, to get to the heart of the matter, something that can really only be touched by tracing that process. He says the result together with the process through which it came about. That's what the real issue is. That's what you have to be able to enact in thought in order to trace the real issue, die Sache selbst, rather than just sort of toying in philosophic or pseudo-philosophic superficialities. And I think I can think of a couple of maybe more concrete examples here to illustrate a little of what Hegel has in mind. I would compare it to, in the first place, we can compare it to something like the difference between writing history and writing a chronicle. Chronicle writing is very, very ancient. There have been chronicles as long as there have been kings and powerful men. A chronicle is just a record of the deeds, the accomplishments, the conquests of rich and powerful men. And they're our first form of textual evidence for history, but they are not by themselves history. At best, they are a relatively reliable body of data that itself still needs to be interpreted. It needs to be sorted into some kind of a coherent narrative, which would be history itself. And we only really get that relatively late. I mean, I think in the humanities we tend to think of figures like Herodotus and Thucydides, the ancient Athenian historians. They're the ones that really get this discipline started. Prior to that, all we had were chronicles. All we had were records of the glorious accomplishments of powerful men. And it's Herodotus and Thucydides that take that body of data and forge it into something, let's call it scientific, but more coherent, something that seems to have a point, something that makes some kind of an argument, a total, unified, universal vision of life. We definitely begin to see that emerge in figures like Herodotus and Thucydides, whereas we don't really see that so much in the ancient chroniclers, where the aim of the text is largely just to flatter the ego of the powerful patron. But I think we can see the difference maybe more in terms of contemporary culture when we think of nerd culture. We think of the habit that so many people have of cultivating private little bodies of expertise that they get to be the lord of. Whether it's the Star Trek lore or baseball statistics or Civil War trivia or whatever it is. There's a specific, and I think specifically modern kind of pleasure. Maybe not, but definitely a specific pleasure in cultivating those private bodies of expertise, something that you know more about than absolutely anybody else. But the problem with them, that can easily resemble intellectual curiosity, but it's not really intellectual curiosity because it's very, very easily satisfied. As soon as the nerd has convinced himself that he knows enough shit, that he's smart, he's done. He doesn't really have to learn anything else because that turns out, in so many cases, I think, to be the only real motive. Being a nerd does not mean being smart. It means having a pathological compulsion to make yourself feel smart all the time. And this leads them to cultivate those sorts of devices, these bodies of obscure lore that they get to know about better than anybody else. The problem is that those bodies don't really add up to anything except the self-esteem of the nerd. There's no real point to them. They're superficial because all they can ever do is reflect the nerd's need for self-esteem, and that's a curiosity that gets satisfied with relatively very little learning. It's satisfied with being right about things, not really with tracing the inverse of that, the finitude of one's correctness about propositions and the need to go back and trace the historical process through which one's opinions emerged, through which they first became historically possible. And I think that's the kind of project that Hegel would identify with this search for the real issue, die Sache selbst. But we're going to want to keep our ears open definitely when he uses that phrase, and I'll try and trace it as closely as I can.